Hello, good afternoon, everyone. And I hope you can see me as well as hear me. This is Himanshu, the director of IIM Indore. And today I'm going to talk to you about leadership in times of crisis. Now, my plan is as follows. We have exactly 60 minutes by the clock, and I'm not going to make you wait for more than 60 minutes. My talk is in three parts. So in the first part, I'm going to talk about what is leadership and how has the definition of leadership evolved over a period of time. In my second part, I'm going to talk about the 5 elements of crisis leadership. What are those things that you need to have in you if you want to face a crisis? And in the third part, I'm going to talk about how should you communicate as a leader during a crisis. So my plan is as follows. I'm going to speak for 10 minutes on each of these elements. And at the end of 10 minutes, every 10-minute slot, I'm going to take the questions there. So what I recommend is that you wait for those 10 minutes before putting in the questions. I can see many of you are wishing me. Thank you so much. And I can see some familiar names inside there. So every 10 minutes, I'll take questions for about 10 minutes, and then I'll go on to the next topic. Be that as it may, even if we run short of time, rest assured that we are going to end this at 4 p.m. So what is leadership? You know, historically, if I were to trace the history of leadership, whenever we thought of leaders, we always thought of leaders as either heroes or martyrs. So whenever we thought of leaders, the entire imagery which came in our heads was that of a person sitting on a horse, preferably black or white, and with a sword drawn in his hand. It was always his and not her. And the entire premise of leadership was that blood should be shed, either by this person of others or of this person for the sake of a cause. So we looked at leaders either as heroes or martyrs, and subsequently we started bracketing them under different categories. So we said that there are some leaders who are charismatic. So these are the leaders who had a vision, who had the personal capability to take risk. They made sure that they looked after their followers, and they always performed unusually, which means that they had an unusual way of actually handling things, and they were called charismatic leaders. And we were very happy with this particular characterization of leaders till such time that we realized that charismatic leaders also had a dark side. Now, that's not the subject matter of today, but at some point of time, I'll probably talk about the dark side of charismatic leadership. And then we started talking about transactional versus transformational leaders. And we said that transactional leaders are those who believe in either laissez-faire, which means they just delegate and then they disappear, or they go up a little bit and they manage by exception. So they are in a disappearing mode, a disappeared mode, till a problem happens, and then they come in there to do some firefighting. Or at the most, a transactional leader can get into something called contingent reward mode, which means that they try to have a reward come punishment system by virtue of which they believe they can lead a collective. However, people said that people need to move from a transactional mode to a transformational mode. And therefore, in transformational mode, a leader always started with something called individualized consideration. These were the leaders who actually looked at the aspirations of the individuals in the collective that they were leading and tried to address those. Subsequently, they went on to intellectual stimulation. They stimulated their people intellectually and then tried to get the best out of them. Subsequently, the third mode they went to was called inspirational motivation, where they inspired people through their commitment. And finally, at their peak, at the pinnacle, they reached something called idealized influence, where they made their own life in such a way that everybody wanted to follow them. Gandhi was a transformational leader at his peak with idealized influence. However, subsequently, the definition as well as the paradigm of leaders actually shifted from leaders to leadership. And people said, say, hey, hang on, let's not look at the individual, but let's look at the process. And thereby, in the social sciences, we came up with a definition of leadership which said that leadership is a process by which a person influences others to accomplish an objective and directs the organization in such a way that makes it more cohesive and coherent. Now you have a definition of leadership which has two, three very interesting terms. And this is what is going to be the background and the backdrop of my conversation with you all today. Leadership is a process. And the moment you say that it's a process, you say that it can be learned, it can be honed, it can be improved upon, and by which a person influences others. So we need to understand, what is this word called influencing? How do you really influence people? And in such a way that makes the collective more cohesive, which means everyone working together, and coherent, where everyone knows what they are expected to do. And basis this, there were three theories of leadership which came about. The first theory of leadership was called the Triad theory. And the Triad theory said leaders are born. Leaders are born because there are some personality traits which lead people naturally into leadership roles. And the Triad theory, therefore, went by the nature debate, by the nature side of the debate. And they said a leader needs to have certain dimensions in his or her personality to actually display effective leadership. And what was those dimensions of personality? They were extraversion, which means people high on extraversion are those people who are very friendly, who like public speaking, who are not very comfortable being all by themselves, but they're very comfortable when they are with a group of people. People who are high on conscientiousness. These are the people who are very trustworthy, who are very reliable, who are very disciplined. Then people who are very high on openness to experience. And who are these people? People who are open to new ideas, people who try out new things, people who try out new places, people who like to try out meeting people who are very, very different to them. And finally, also people who had emotional intelligence. Now here, one must understand the difference between emotional stability, which is one of the 5 dimensions, the neuroticism dimension of the Big 5 model, versus emotional intelligence. When you say somebody is emotionally stable, what you're saying is that whether there is happiness, whether there is sadness, whether things are good, whether things are bad, this person does not display any emotions, nothing on the face. Whereas when we talk about emotional intelligence, what we are saying is that these are the people who have the capability to display organizationally desired emotions, which means no matter what they're feeling, no matter what their felt emotions are, they actually have the capability to express those emotions which are in line with what people are expecting at that point of time. And therefore, they have this capability of getting over the cognitive dissonance, which is the dissonance arising because of the difference between the felt emotions and expressed emotion. And this is called emotional intelligence. So this was the Triad theory. And then came another theory which said, hey, hang on. Sometimes a crisis or an important event may actually cause a person to rise to the occasion and bring out extraordinary qualities in an otherwise ordinary person. And this was called the situational theory of leadership. So there were many people who were at the receiving end of the apartheid, but this particular man, when pushed out of a train at a railway station in South Africa, decided to protest. And the rest is history. Of course, we are talking about Gandhi. And Gandhi was a situational leader. Gandhi came out of a crisis, which he saw in South Africa. And based on the situational leadership model, there are several models which try to explain as to how a leader must adapt his or her leadership style basis the kind of a situation he or she finds himself or herself in. So for example, you have the Hershey and Blanchard model, which would say that the leadership style should be adapted by leaders depending on whether their followers are capable or not, and whether they are willing or not. Capability means, do they have the technical competence or not? And willingness means, are they self-motivated or not? And they said that for those followers who are both capable and willing, your leadership style should be that of a monitor. Simply monitor, don't interfere in their work. For those people whose leadership, whose followership is actually unable but willing, which means they do not have the technical competence, but they're self-motivated. In that case, you must become a coach. For those people who are actually able but unwilling, they have the technical competence, but they're not self-motivated, For them, you have to become a support system. And for those people who are neither capable nor willing, you have to be directive. You have to actually tell them how to do things and make sure that you keep an eye on them. So this was a situational model of leadership. And finally, we had the behavioral theory of leadership. And the behavioral theory said that leaders can be trained. Leaders can be made. People can choose to become leaders provided they learn certain leadership skills. And what are those leadership skills that you need to learn? That is going to be my second part of the talk. But before I get on to the second part of the talk, I'm done with the first part of the talk, which was to take you through the history of leaders and leadership and how this history has evolved over a period of time where we have shifted from looking at an individual to looking at the process itself. So this is the time when I'm going to take some questions. So any questions? So I can see a lot of the questions are actually around if you're going to get a certificate or not, which is not a question you need to be asking me. But I'm told that you will get a certificate. But are there any questions or whatever I've spoken so far is what I'm looking at. So what is the difference between level 5 leaders and charismatic leaders? And then I have something, are leaders born or leaders made? Would it be useful to see them as a combination of three theories? Authoritative, moral leaders, which category does an individual fall? Okay, hang on. I have made a quick note of some of these. Let me try to look at the difference. You see the difference between other forms of leaders and charismatic leaders. And I'm glad that you've asked me this question. On the transformational leaders or the type 5 leaders, they all have a vision. They have this personal capability of taking a risk. They also look after the well-being of their followers. But where charismatic leaders differ from other categories of leaders, including type 5, is that charismatic leaders have an unusual way of actually doing things. So you can never predict their behavior. And which is why the question which is also being asked is there a flip side to it? Is there a flip side to charisma? And the answer is yes, there is a flip side to charismatic leadership. I said that there was something called the dark side of charismatic leadership. And the dark side of charismatic leadership is that they suffer from something which is called the dark triad of leadership. Very many times, these charismatic leaders tend to actually go beyond the organization, which means that they become so self-absorbed that they think that they are bigger than the organization. They think that the organization is never going to survive without them. And they get into something called the dark triad of leadership, which I have spoken about in a paper of mine that was published in Organizational Dynamics. And the dark triad of leadership is narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Narcissism is when you're so self-absorbed that you think you are the center of the world. Machiavellianism is you are manipulative. So for you, ends justify the means. So once you have decided that this is what you want to be, this is where you wish to reach, you will go through any means, you will use any means to reach that particular position. And psychopathy means that some of the decisions that you take may actually be harmful to many people, but you don't give a damn. And this dark side of the leadership is this dark triad of the leadership is actually the flip side of charismatic leadership. The other question which has come in through many of you, the nature versus nurture debate, and is there a balance between the two? Now, this is a debate which is endless. So essentially, as I said, that the earlier theories said that leaders are born, and therefore they were going by nature. They said it's in your DNA. Either you're a born leader or you're not. And if you historically look at leaders, so for example, whenever I teach leadership in my class, the first thing I do is, once I've given them the definition, I say, hey, give me the names of a few leaders. And when you look at a bunch of leaders, you will find that there were some of them, indeed, who did display leadership qualities very, very young. So clearly there was something in them even from before. There was something in their personality which actually made them a leader at a very, very early age. But then there is a large part of leaders who actually grew into leadership roles. They actually acquired leadership over a period of time. And therefore, what I would say is that there is a balance. You would find both, which are nature-born leaders, and you'll find leaders who have been nurtured over a period of time. And as I said, that there's also the third theory, which is a situational theory, that sometimes a situation actually brings out leadership qualities inside a person, either through self-realization, like in case of Gandhi, there was a self-realization, or somebody else makes this person realize. So there were many people standing on the shore of the ocean and wondering what to do about it. When this old wise man tells this younger man that, hey, you have it inside you. Why don't you take a leap and cross this ocean? And the young man said, me? The young Mahapandit said, me? And the older wise person said, yes, you can do it. And this young man took a leap of faith and crossed the ocean. Of course, I'm talking about Hanuman in this case, who was once again a situational leader, but there was not a self-realization, but there was a motivation given by somebody else, and that situation brought out that leadership quality inside that person. So coming back to the nature versus nurture debate, I think that the theorists, the social scientists, have come to a very crucial kind of an understanding and a compromise, saying it's 50-50. So the effect of your DNA or your genetics is 50%, and the remaining 50% is your environment plus your experiences plus your learning, etc. Now, this is an arbitrary number, as arbitrary as it could be, but suffice to say that leadership can be explained by both of these theories. One of the other questions is when you're naming individuals and asking me to slot them, I don't think it's in my place to slot anybody in any of these leadership roles, or in leadership styles, or even in these leadership dimensions, for the simple reason that I don't know them very well. I mean, I know that the people that you're talking to me are public figures, but be that as it may, I don't know them very well. I may be, even if I make a judgment, my judgment would be based on something that I know from their public life, and that is not something that I would want to actually talk about, not individuals. How to be an admirable leader? This is very interesting. Admirable, I really don't know what you mean by admirable leader. Why? Because there are two things over here. Are you looking at admiration from other people? Because if at all you're looking at admiration from other people, there is a chance that you may also start looking at approbation from other people. And by approbation from other people, what I mean is that whenever you make a decision, you would want to look at other people and how they are reacting to it and whether they liked your decision or not. See, this is a dicey thing to get into, because as a leader, sometimes when you have the conviction, you may be the only person on the other side. But please remember, if you have the conviction and if you're right, then you constitute a majority of one. No matter where everyone else is, everyone else may be on the other side. But as a leader, you have to show that conviction. And therefore, if at all you want admiration, I would say that you should seek admiration from yourself. Don't look for approbation from without, from the outside. Look at approbation from within. Make sure that whatever you are doing, whatever decisions that you're taking, you are taking them with a very, very clear conscience. How to measure leadership in a situation of crisis? I will talk about the dimensions of leadership in a crisis shortly. A difference between managers and leaders. Very, very cliched statement, but managers manage while leaders lead, which means managers are more operational. They try to look at more of the execution part, whereas a leader is both a visionary and an action-oriented person. But here, let me give a caveat. It is not that only vision is good enough for you to become leader. Please remember, if you have a vision, but you do not execute it, you do not put into action, then you are simply a dreamer. You're simply a dreamer because you're not putting anything into action. If you're only action-oriented, but you're not visionary, then you can be a good follower. And if you have neither, I'm sorry, in that case, you're neither a manager nor a leader. In that case, you're pretty impoverished so far as leadership qualities are concerned. So remember, a leader is a one who has a vision and then makes sure that he or she executes that vision with consistent and persistent action. Does situational leader work every time? It does. It does. In fact, the situational leadership model that I spoke about should be used not merely to actually apply that leadership style with other people, but should also be used to delegate power. So if you want to delegate your role to somebody, so let's say you're going on a leave or you're unwell and therefore you want to delegate your responsibility, make sure that you delegate your responsibility only to those followers who are both able as well as willing. Do not delegate it to somebody who's able but unwilling, or who's willing but unable, because that will lead to a disaster. So make sure that you've always categorized the people, the collective that you're leading, into these 4 categories and delegate accordingly. All right, so I think I have taken enough so far as this particular thing is concerned, and some of the questions that I can't take, if in the end, time permitting, I will take them again. But let me move on to the second part of my conversation, which is the elements of crisis leadership. Now, oh wow, so you can probably see on the other side that there is a book. And incidentally, that's the only book that I've written so far. My 2 other books are in the pipeline. The book is called Negotiation and published, of course, by McGraw-Hill, which is organizing this particular webinar. In my book, I have spoken about the 5 dimensions of negotiating ability. And in fact, those 5 dimensions of negotiating ability map on to what I call the 5 elements of crisis leadership. And this also maps on to the behavioral theory of leadership, where you actually say that, hey, what are the behaviors which if I perform and practice, I can actually become a leader? So therefore, my recommendation to you here is practice these 5 behaviors. Inculcate these 5 things inside you. The first one is called artfulness. Artfulness is a mix of shrewdness and calculatedness, which means that you need to have ability to manage expectations and you need to have a foresight. Try to build this capability inside you. What does foresight mean? It means that you should be able to anticipate the consequences of your action. You should be able to anticipate what is outside that window, what is beyond that wall, what is outside that door. Which means that you need to reflect. You need to always take a pause and reflect before making a decision, thinking, okay, what can this lead to immediately? What can this lead to in the midterm? What can this lead to in the long term? For example, a situation such as lockdown. If you actually lock down at a particular time, what is the time at which you should lock down the country? Because if you do it a little early, you will have a situation where you actually need the lockdown, but you've actually locked down for so long that people can't take it anymore. If you lock down too late, in that case, you may have already allowed the infection to set in. And therefore, having that kind of a foresight and also ability to manage expectations. Now, this is a little philosophical, to allow me to engage you in a little bit of a philosophy. Most of us think that we are individuals and we try to stamp our individuality on the face of this earth. Now, are we really individuals? Are we really individuals? This is a question that many philosophers have tried to answer. And there is a particular philosopher, I love his work, Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher. Now, when do you really become an individual? When do you really become an independent entity? When the doctor cuts the umbilical cord. Yeah, the doctor cuts up, because before that you're deriving everything from the mother through the placenta. When the doctor cuts the umbilical cord, you become an independent identity. Ironically, at the same time when you're born, you become something else. You become a son or a daughter. You become a brother or a sister. You become a nephew or a niece. You become something that Jean-Paul Sartre calls reciprocal roles. Roles where there are 2 people. And when it comes to reciprocal roles, there are 2 elements of roles which become pertinent. One is called role perception. The other is called role expectation. Role perception is how do you perceive a role ought to be played out. So let's say if I'm playing the role of son to my father, How do I perceive a son should be? That is called role perception. Role expectation is, how does the other person perceive this role ought to be played out? So in my role of a son to my father, how does my father perceive a son should be? That is called role expectation. And more often than not, they are not the same. And therefore, your ability to manage the expectations of these multiple roles that you will be playing during a crisis. So during the crisis, even your family has expectations from you because they are facing exactly the same crisis. Perhaps your organizational people, other stakeholders, your customers, your suppliers, people around you, the community, the country. And therefore, how do you actually manage everybody's expectations? And that would come in if you actually reflect upon the difference between perception and expectation. So that is the first element of crisis leadership that you need to develop. The second is diplomacy. And diplomacy is a combination of tact, sensitivity, and the ability to look at issues with acutely penetrating mental discernment. Now, that's a mouthful of a phrase, acutely penetrating mental discernment. But what it means is that you should be able to actually listen carefully to people. And to develop this crisis leadership capability inside you, you need to work on two skills of yours. First is you should have high levels of tolerance. Because remember, in the times of crisis, people are going to jump on you even for the decisions that you make in their interest. And you should have that capability to absorb all of that criticism which comes to your way. And the second thing is reflective listening. You know, there are two categories of listeners on this planet. One who listen to respond, and the second who listen to understand. Most people belong to the first category. So if at all somebody is talking to them, their mind starts wandering and wandering right after the first couple of seconds, trying to think of a very wise answer to give, or at least to sound intelligent and give an intelligent answer. Not at all. In crisis, a leader has to listen to understand and not to give smart answers. How do you listen to understand? Make sure that you're not interrupting people when they are talking to you. Make sure you're not interrupting people when they're asking you questions. Ask open-ended questions. Probe. Try to delve deeper. There are some things that people say, and there are many things that people don't say. Try to even understand those things that they are not saying. And that is the diplomacy part. The third element of crisis leadership that you need to develop inside you is detachedness. And detachedness is about rational thinking and dissociating judgment from desire. So differentiate what is coming from your head versus what is coming from your heart. And to get this, you need to actually work on these couple of skills. One is devoid of ego. Let go of your ego, because remember, the moment you bring your ego in, you will never respond to the crisis. You will respond to your sense of looking important or showing your importance to the other people. And also, in the times of a crisis, act only after due deliberation. I'll give you an example from my life. So these were my early days in academia. I had just joined academia, and I was given a consultancy assignment where I had to go to this place, and there was this public sector company which was being privatized and sold off to a Canadian company. And my job was to hammer out the terms and conditions of this particular sale. So I went there. I was sitting with the CMD in his office. And while we were talking, I heard some voices coming from afar. But initially, I didn't pay much attention to them. But when those voices became a little louder and they became a little closer, they became a matter of concern to me, because those voices were saying, Himanshu Rai, Murdabad, Murdabad. I am Professor, Wapas Jao, Wapas Jao. And I said, hey, hang on. Himanshu Rai, me. I am Professor. Me. Clearly, this is about me. Lo and behold, after a few minutes, there was a knock on the door of the CMD. He went to open the door. I followed him. About 400, 500 odd people in the foyer shouting and sloganeering, Himanshu Rai, Murdabad, Murdabad. Now, I went and asked him. I said, what's the problem? What happened? And this big giant of a person, clearly the pack leader, comes to me and says, "Aap kya is sansthan ke hain? Are you from this organization?" I said, "No." "Aapke parivar ka koi bhi is sansthan mein hai? Is anybody from your family a part of this organization?" I said, "No." तो यहाँ क्या कर रहे हो, वापस जाओ. And he pushed me. And then the heckling started. So I was being pushed around. And this was a crisis. This was a crisis situation, for me at least, because there were 400, 500 people. Now, had I brought my ego in, I would have done one of the two things. I would have either pushed back, and had I done that, surely enough, I would have been beaten up, because no matter how great a person I might be physically, there were 400, 500 people. Or I would have said, forget it. Why am I even putting my life on danger here? I should just go back and leave this entire thing. But the whole point was, I always wanted to be somebody who was good at negotiating with people. I wanted to be the best negotiator on this planet, and I continued trying to be one. And therefore, I dealt with crisis by not letting my ego come in. Instead, I just raised my voice and I said, hang on. You can continue doing this for the rest of the evening, but I'm not going back. However, let me assure you another thing. I'm not going to put even one word on the terms and conditions of the sale till I've spoken to every one of you. So why don't you guys come in and let's have a conversation? And I immediately picked up that guy who had first pushed me, 2-3 of his henchmen who were around him. And all throughout, my eyes were darting around and I was trying to identify those people in the crowd who did not like what was happening to me. And since I had managed to identify 4-5 of them, I brought them inside. The moment I had these 10 people inside the CMD's office, I started talking to them. And within 5 minutes, one of them broke down and he said, "Sir, job chali jayenge." And that's when I realized that their problem was not with the selling of the public sector company. Their problem was that of attrition. They were afraid that some jobs may get lost because of this particular transaction. And at that moment itself, I told them no attrition. That will be one part, that will be the first part and the most important part of the terms and conditions of the sale. However, I said the other organization cannot afford to give you the kind of salary that you're used to in a public sector organization. So all of you have to actually take a haircut. You have to take a pay cut. And thereafter, I just had to negotiate with them as to figure out as to what kind of a pay cut all of them had to take. Now, this was possible. I could handle this crisis, even though it was a minor crisis, because I let go of the ego and acted only after due deliberation. So extremely important to be detached. The fourth dimension is fair-mindedness, which means there has to be a sense of selflessness and equality when you're handling the crisis. Now, what do I mean by this? You as a leader during a crisis should be able to generate trust. And how do you generate trust? By making sure that you're not bringing any personal agenda into the crisis. So many people, so there are vultures when it comes to crisis, which means that they try to feed off the pity and the misery of those who are being affected by the crisis. Make sure that you're seen as doing something genuinely for the people who are getting affected by the crisis and not for yourself. And by yourself, I mean not just you as an individual, but you're not doing something only for the sake of the company or the organization that you represent, or for the sake of something financial. Because even during the COVID time, you will see that many people are coming and approaching you for things that they say are going to make your life hunky-dory, and some of the things are not essentials during a crisis. And therefore, try not to get into that kind of a trap when you are facing a situation of crisis. Your followers need to trust you during the time of a crisis. And finally, the last dimension of crisis leadership that you need to work upon is sagacity. And sagacity means that you need to have reliance on your own counsel. And for that, sometimes you may have to go beyond the rule book. Don't follow the rule book like a blinkered person. Please note that when it comes to crisis, when it comes to tough situations sometimes call for unique kind of decisions. They call for decisions which may not be according to the rule book, but those are the decisions which are needed at that point of time, for the simple reason that a rule book is made for general conditions when everything is hunky-dory. So you should and you may have to go beyond that. And how do you develop this particular sagacity inside you? You develop it, first of all, by making sure that you develop expertise. Expertise in what? Anything. It doesn't matter. Because when you are considered as an expert in a particular subject, there is something in social sciences called halo effect. And halo effect means that if you're good in something, people start assuming that you're good in multiple other things. And that stands to your advantage. And this is something you will see in terms of political leaders, in terms of business leaders. They may be good in just one thing, but many people then start attributing anything that they say as super knowledge because they believe that this person can do no wrong. And also, maintaining personal integrity is a sign of sagacity. And what do I mean by maintaining personal integrity? Do what you say, which means that as a leader, what you expect others to do, you should be able to do it as well. So for instance, we are facing this crisis even in our campus. So at IIM Indore campus, we have 150 families which are still here, and we have about 80 students which are still here. Most of them are, of course, doctoral students for whom home is this, but we have about 20 students who could not go to their home for multiple reasons. Either parents were not there or there was a lockdown before they could actually get out, or some of them genuinely thought that this place was far more safer than wherever their parents were. Be that as it may, I have to run this campus with less than 1/4 of the helping staff. So be it housekeeping, be it security, I have less than 1/4 in each of these categories, be it mess workers, etc. Now, what do? So what we have done is we have actually within 3 or 4 days time, I actually asked the campus residents to volunteer. And what I did was I divided the chores into multiple categories. So I said, we have gardening, we have a beautiful 200-acre campus. I would love to see you people once things are okay. And it's a very green campus, so we have lots of plants. We have a dog shelter, so we also take care of animals in this campus. We, of course, have lots of security points in this perimeter because this campus is built on a hill. So the terrain is such that makes the security of the campus a little more difficult than, say, the other campuses. We have to run the mess. We have to actually serve food apart from preparing food. So we have, and of course, we have to do the cleaning, etc. So what I did was I asked for volunteers for each of these categories. Now, clearly, other categories, there were people who were far more willing to go for security or for gardening, etc. But when it comes to cleaning and sweeping, jharu lagana, pocha lagana in the campus, throughout the academic block, and it's a huge block, there were less volunteers. Now, what do you do as a leader? As a leader, you pick up the toughest of jobs. And therefore, I started leading this particular volunteering activity of cleaning. So the first day when I went there, apart from me, there were about 4 or 5 odd people. And we started cleaning, and it took us about 2 hours to clean a particular portion that we had thought. But the next time when I went there were 10 people. And the last time when I went there were about 20 people who were willing to do this. Now, why were they willing to do this? Because I showed them personal integrity, that I'm willing to do whatever I expect you to do. Now, once again, this is a lesson that Gandhi has taught all of us. And of course, nothing comes close to cleanliness. Taking care, if you leave your surroundings cleaner than you found them, you are doing a great service to this entire universe. But the point I was trying to make over here is that if you display personal integrity during the times of a crisis, you will find that many people are going to actually join hands with you. So these are the 5 dimensions of crisis leadership that you need to inculcate if you want to actually show this during the times of crisis, if you want to show leadership skills during the crisis: artfulness, diplomacy, detachedness, fair-mindedness, and sagacity. And the details of this you will find in my book. So I'll take a pause here after the part 2 of my session, and I'll take some of the questions here. Leading through examples. Yes, absolutely. Leading through example is indeed one of the better ways. Wow, I mean, it's amazing at the speed at which you are writing the questions. What is the 4th element? The 4th element, as I said, is a fair-mindedness, which means selflessness and quality. And that means that you make sure that you generate trust amongst your people. the collective that you're leading, as well as make sure that you do not have any personal agenda. So don't seek glory in the times of crisis. People are going to make that out, because many a times we believe that, what if I do both? What if I also work hard but also seek glory? But the moment you do that, so for example, if at all you're giving out things and you have your picture pasted in there, at some point of time, people will remember, once a crisis is over, that this person tried to make use of a crisis. And that does not leave anybody with a good taste. Remember, people are very likely to forget what you did for them, but everyone will always remember how you made them feel. And therefore, if you made people feel that you're doing a charity to them, you're doing something because, not because it's a right thing to do, but because they are the downtrodden ones. Remember, nobody feels happy about such things, and they'll always remember that you treated them not with dignity. Lots of questions over here. Nepotism, clearly nepotism, not a great thing at any times. Forget during a crisis. What are some of the resources I would suggest? Now you must also read books which make you reflect. And I used to teach a subject called leadership through literature before I took over this directorship. I intend to start it again. And what we used to do was, we used to pick up 8 pieces of literature. I taught that with a colleague of mine. And we used to pick up 8 pieces of literature. And by analyzing those pieces of literature, we used to build frameworks of leadership in class. And for each book, there was a theme associated with it. So for example, we had Alchemist, the book by Paulo Coelho, and the theme associated with it was vision and action. We had one of my favorite books, Siddharth by Hermann Hesse, a German author, and the theme associated with it was passion and compassion. We had the biography of J.R.E. Tata, Beyond the Last Blue Mountain, written by Rusi Lala, and we had the theme career and character associated with it. And the reason why we picked up these books was because these books made you think. These books made you reflect. So instead of being normative, so I don't like books which tell you, do this, do that. I like books which make you think. So if you look at Alchemist, through the journey of Santiago and what he learns throughout that particular journey that he undertakes and the people that he meets, some of those things start resonating with you. Some of those things actually connect with you, and you say, hey, I had some experience of this kind. And that makes you think about that particular experience and what you can draw out of that experience. If you look at Siddharth, then the protagonist Siddharth, once again, the people that he meets, once again, his journey of trying to understand himself, and most importantly, a conversation which he has in that book with the Buddha himself. And today happens to be the Buddha Purnima, a very happy Buddha Purnima to all of you, and maybe follow the teachings of the Buddha. And Siddharth actually has a conversation with Buddha, where he asks him some question. I mean, I wouldn't give it away. I strongly urge you people to read the book. And the way Buddha answers and the way Siddharth actually takes that answer is again a beautiful way of exploring yourself. So I would recommend that you pick up those books. And another one of my favorite is Mudra Rakshas, which is a play by Vishak Dutt, a Sanskrit play. Of course, you have the English translation, which is available, which is the story of Chanakya annihilating the Nand kings. So how Chanakya annihilated the Nand kings is shown through that particular story. And a beautiful part of that particular story, I'm going to give away a little part of it. So the prime minister, Chanakya was Chandragupta Maurya's prime minister, and the prime minister of the opposite party, Malaiketu, was a person called Rakshas. And hence the name of the book, Mudra Rakshas. His name was Rakshas. Once Chanakya outmaneuvers Rakshas, Rakshas was also a very intelligent person. He was on the other side. Once Chanakya outmaneuvers him, make sure that everybody on Rakshas's side was dead, Chanakya actually asks Chandragupta Maurya to make Rakshas his prime minister. Chanakya says, I'm now going to go to the forest, and now you should make Rakshas your prime minister. And Chandragupta Maurya is astonished. He's shocked. He says, why? And Chanakya says, I am a good advisor and a good prime minister when it comes to situations of crisis. But Rakshas is a very good administrator and will be a very good prime minister when it comes to a situation of peace, where what you have to do is maintain peace. And here is humility personified. Chanakya was humility personified, because while he was the wittiest of them all, while he was the greatest of them all when it came to political maneuverings, he had the humility to acknowledge that there are times when he may not be the best person to be in a particular position. And therefore, when you read material such as this, when you go through sources and books such as this, they give you a lot of ideas, they give you a lot of thoughts. Once again, I'm not saying take them in a normative sense, that whatever Chanakya says is the ultimate truth. No, not at all. But whatever he does or says in this particular book actually makes you think. So think and then choose and decide for yourself. Okay, I think we are running short on time. So what I'll do is I'll very quickly take care of the last part of my talk, which is how to communicate during a situation of crisis. And then, maybe I will be able to take one or two questions thereafter. Now, before I actually talk about crisis communication, we need to understand what is communication. So the word communication comes from communicare, and etymologically the root is communis. And communis means to share or to make common. But what is it that you're sharing? What is it that you're making common? Now, herein lies the theory of communication, which says that communication is a process of encoding and decoding. So there is a sender who has a message. Communication is an exchange of message, is a process of exchange of messages. So there is a sender who has a message in the head, and the sender then encodes the message in terms of, say, words, a particular language, some actions, some gestures, etc. And then using a medium sends it to the receiver, and the receiver then decodes the message. And therefore, the important part of this entire thing is that how does the receiver decode the message is far more important than how the sender has encoded it. Because the way the receiver decoded the message will actually determine whether the receiver understood in the way it was meant or not. And therefore, you must understand that communication is not merely about how you speak. It is about what are the others hearing? What are the others making out of whatever it is that you said? Because sometimes we fall into the trap of equating communication with our grasp over the language. If I can speak great English, people think I'm a great communicator. No, not at all. I may be understood by some people who understand English, but I may not be understood by people who do not understand English or who do not understand complicated English. And therefore, please remember, it's not about you trying to play on your strength as a communicator. You have to play on the strength of the receiver and try and figure out what is the receiver far more likely to understand exactly the way that you intended to. Now, there are some barriers which come in the way, especially during the time of crisis. And therefore, the next 5 minutes, I'll talk about those barriers and how you should not fall into those traps during crisis as a leader. First is selective perception. Please note that people always perceive things the way they wish to. So, for example, if in a crisis, you try and say that 20% people will get severely affected, versus if you say that 80% people are going to be left unscathed, they will not be affected. In that case, people are far more likely to follow you. This is what psychological research says, in the latter case rather than the former case. So if you say 20% people will get severely affected, come with me, do this, people are less likely to accept it, as compared to if you say we can save 80% people. 80% people will not be affected at all. So how you frame your communication becomes extremely important. Remember, in the times of crisis, there is negativity all the way. There's negativity everywhere. For example, if you look at the social media, my goodness, it's unbelievable. If you look at the social media, you will get anxious irrespective of how positive a person you are. And therefore, as a leader, you are the person who's expected to bring about some calm, who are expected to show the silver lining. You're expected to show some ray of hope. And therefore, remember, even your communication has to be made in such a way that also brings out the positives, that also brings out some good stories that are happening during the times of that particular crisis. The second is information flow. Now, clearly, even as a leader, you can't be the person who can be talking directly to everybody. So you need some people who can then carry your message to the other people. Now, how do you actually do that? Most organizations use a hub and spoke model. So you have a hub, which could either be the leader, which could be the MD of the company or the CEO of the company, or it could be the corporate communications department or the public relations department. And then you have certain spokes. So from here, the communication or the message may go to a particular department, and then from the department, it might get percolated to the other things. Now, there was this very interesting study which we got done. So I'm not too sure as to how many of you know me personally or my life story, my professional life story, that is. So after my engineering, I worked with Tata Steel for 8.5 years before deciding to shift to academia. And of those 8.5 years, I spent 3 very beautiful years working with the corporate communications department of Tata Steel on a special assignment where my job was to get quality systems, start a TV channel for Tata Steel, and also draft the communication policy for Tata Steel. Now, we got a study done at that point of time across the steel industries in the world. And we got a study done on credibility of the communication, which was, we wanted this particular organization to find out who do people find the most credible source in an organization and who do people find the least credible source in an organization. Now, the results were very, very surprising, and I'm going to share them with you, although this study was obviously many, many years back. The result was that people found their immediate manager to be the most credible source of information. So for a manager, it was the assistant general manager. For an AGM, it was a DGM. For a DGM, it was a GM. Likewise, for a worker, it was the supervisor. For the supervisor, it was a charge man, so on and so forth. I'm talking about a typical hierarchical manufacturing process organization, because I was talking about the steel industry. But the far more important part and the weirdest part was, who did people find the least credible source of information? And believe it or not, it was the corporate communications department. People found corporate communication, people cited corporate communication, the PR department, to be the least credible source of information. And then when we dug a little deeper, what they pointed out was that the job of this department is to actually present truth in a way which is palatable to the outside world. And because it was the job to present the truth in a certain way to the outside world, even the people inside were unwilling to trust this information which was coming in. Now, why am I giving you this information? Don't assume that whatever collective that you're leading, people who you think are the most are considered to be the most credible by people at large are really the ones. Find out who does the public, who does the collective, who does your organization, depending on whatever collective that you're leading. Who do people find most credible when it comes to getting information? Is it a colleague? Is it a peer? Is it a subordinate? Is it the grapevine? Is it a particular bunch of individuals? Identify those individuals and make sure that those individuals are your spoke in the times of a crisis, while you are the hub through which the communication is being channelized. The third are emotional issues. Sometimes emotional issues can actually create a block during the times of crisis. So for example, if at all you make a statement during the crisis blaming a certain gender, blaming a certain region, blaming a certain religion, blaming a certain caste, blaming a certain class, rest assured you're going to lose the support not just of that person whose name you have used as an emotive issue, but of a whole lot of people, because people will start looking at it from a perspective where they say that, hey, this guy has some kind of a personal agenda which goes beyond the crisis. Because remember, when a crisis hits, the crisis hits everybody. And therefore, you can't become selective and say, I'm going to blame this person and I'm going to help that person. No, just like a doctor, the doctor takes the Hippocratic Oath and the doctor says, I am going to serve everyone. A teacher, we have to actually teach everyone. We have to share our knowledge with everyone. We can't say that, hey, you are not worthy enough to actually gain my knowledge, so on and so forth. We know that history is replete with certain examples where people were not found worthy on the basis of something which was an artificial divide which was created by the society at that particular time. But please remember, those people are not and will never be looked at as leaders. They'll be always be pointed fingers at. And therefore, you should not bring these emotive issues, which can actually create a distraction in the times of crisis. And finally, the last one is that people need information and not data during the times of crisis. And more often than not, we tend to give them data. Just to give you an example, something which has always bothered me about the airlines, that whenever there is a late arrival of a particular aircraft or of a particular flight, the thing that annoys us, and I can say that because I have actually spoken to people to try and gauge as to what is it that actually got them hassle. The thing that annoys people is not the fact that the flight is late, because people expect that sometimes things happen which are beyond the control of people. What they actually get angry about or irked about is the fact that there is no information. Nobody is telling you as to when is the flight about to land. You're already there at the gate. And most importantly, even if they tell you, they say, we apologize for the late arrival of the aircraft, but the late arrival of the aircraft is because it had arrived late at the previous destination. But that doesn't tell you anything. Or even in the craft, when you are in the flight, the hostess would then announce that we apologize for this delay, but this delay was because of the late arrival of the aircraft. Now, that's tautological. Of course, we know that the aircraft arrived late, but what you need is information. What really happened? Was there an operational issue? Was it bad weather? Was there something wrong? Because once you know the reasons, you feel composed and you say, good enough reason for me to actually say, okay, it happens. For example, a person coming late to your class, or somebody entering late into a webinar, or somebody responding to your mail late. If the person says, I'm sorry, I'm late, but I got delayed. Of course, I know that you got delayed. When it comes to a time of crisis, people are already on their edges. Their nerves are already frayed. And therefore, what they need is some clear, credible, and timely communication. And that clarity, credibility, and timeliness is what makes data information. So finally, I would like to end with this. The three elements that I've spoken about, I gave you a historical timeline simply to tell you that people are not focusing on individuals now, they're focusing on the process. And if you want, you can become a leader in your own right. It doesn't matter what your DNA is. Number two, crisis calls for a certain typical and certain very, very specific capabilities to be displayed if you want to be a leader, and therefore work on those 5 capabilities that I spoke about. And the third, the most important thing in crisis is how you communicate with other people. And this communication can have certain barriers, which I have actually tried to tell you about. So it's all, I just have 1 more minute, so I'll take one question, which if there is somebody who's really dying to ask that question to me. Thank you so much for all those lovely things, and you guys are too generous with your words. You've written some very beautiful things out there. I enjoy being a teacher, and which is why all of that you're saying actually comes across. Okay, all of this looks only like Gurgan to me. Good, and I thank you very much with all my humility. I don't see questions there. But anyways, it's 4. So I guess I should close it down. And if at all there are any questions, I'm sure McGraw-Hill would find a way of collating those questions and sending them to me. My email, my number, everything can be discovered if you do a Google search. I'll just end this session by saying that tough times bring out the toughness inside of leaders. Remember, there may be some multiple values that people may want to have, but of all the values that you need, courage is the most important value, because in the absence of courage, you will never be able to follow any other value in your life. And the simplest definition of leader that I have found is that a leader is a good person who talks well. And these are 2 very loaded terms. When you talk about talking well, I'm talking about all of those elements of communication that I spoke about. And when I talk about a good person, this term good person is actually loaded, because a good person is one who does the right things. The good person does the right things not for the sake of what he or she will get out of it, but the good person does the right things simply because they are right things to do. So stay home, stay safe, and I hope that you're going to take something out of this conversation that I had. I enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed reading all that you have written. So God bless you all and take care.